Welcome in another edition of the Casual Genius here. More music on the way for this episode. We seem to have found the rhythm of summer releases, it seems like. Um, we kind of talked a little bit about the fact that this project had dropped last week. We're going to be reviewing the new Lil Yachty and James Blake combined album called Bad Cameo. I guess before we dive into this one too much, um, what's your what's your feelings on Lil Yachty as an artist, James Blake as well, if you've kind of listened to him up until getting to this point?
So I know nothing about James Blake. Not a clue who that dude is. I still have no idea. Um, but with Lil Yachty, I didn't even hate him when he was on his little like SoundCloud rap career and like was coming up with who'd he come up with? Like Juice and X
It
and
was like Kodak and
oh God.
21 and
Yeah,
all
like
those guys.
yeah, like so I didn't mind it at all. It wasn't necessarily my style, especially at that point.
Right.
Um, but like going back to some of those things, there's a couple here and there songs where I'm like, oh, this is still a vibe. But then when he kind of transitioned into this experimental genre, I was um not fond of it at all
Mm.
because I didn't do experimental. Then you started referring some other albums that would be considered experimental, and I started kind of appreciating it more and whatnot. The last Lil Yachty project that we got listening to, was uh, was it one of my top 10? It might have made my top 10 list.
I think it was an honorable mention, if I remember right, for you.
Yeah, even then, like so I definitely appreciate it more. So with this one, I never really know what to expect just because that's how experimental goes.
Yeah.
But oh, it's such a big upgrade than the freaking Imagine Dragons album we listened to.
Oh
I'll say
yeah,
that.
yeah. I mean, anything we reviewed would be an upgrade there. I'm kind of like you. When Lil Yachty came out, I wasn't the biggest diehard of his, but there was tracks that I was like, it's fun, like Minnesota, all these other, little catchy tunes that he's got are just kind of fun. Um, and then really it was like it honestly has been like the last year and a half for me that I think he's kind of transitioned into more than just like a fun artist and is actually like making interesting cohesive bodies of work that I feel like are going to stand more the test of time than just like the short term in the 5 to 10 years 20 years that he's going to be an artist, that we'll kind of look back and be like Lil Yachty was a guy doing something outside the normal in
Yeah.
the future. James Blake for me has always been a guy that I've always appreciated his uniqueness, and I think his last album last year was one of my honorable mentions, or it was close to it at least. And but for me, he's never been like an artist that I'll come back to an entire album from. It's more like spots here and there that I appreciate him.
Yeah.
But I think them coming together for this is a really unique and interesting collab, particularly with the two projects they put out last year. I was really excited to hear what they would come up with after hearing those two albums separately.
Right.
And so let's start off here talking about production. How did you feel about the way this album was laid out?
Dude, it was beautiful. I loved the production on this one. It was a majority of the tracks were very relaxing. Something that you could like easily just get lost in. Um, I was just laying down when listening to the album. I listened to it twice today. And I was just laying down and just it gave me the same vibe as when I was watching like Interstellar at certain times. Like you're just like, wow, this is like what's going
Yeah.
on here? This is amazing. It's very relaxing. And they're all pretty unique from one another. Definitely some standouts. Like I think one of the best produced tracks was the last track, which is Red Carpet, I believe.
Yeah.
I thought that was very beautifully done. But yeah, production, I gave it a 9.
Yeah, I'm pretty close to that as well. I gave it an 8. And the only reason being, I think everything you said is true. For me, it was in terms of the musical production, like the actual beats and instrumentals. I think it was just slightly a step down from Let's Start Here that Lil
Mhm.
Yachty did last year. I think I enjoyed that production just a little bit more. But I think at its best on here, it's very refreshing, innovative, like these experimental soundscapes almost that you're talking about, where it's like just putting you in this, relaxing, unique airspace. And really what I love that it does is it complements all the beats complement the vocal chemistry of both artists very well, which I think is a challenge to do when you have such unique artists that you could like very easily do something that would work for one and not the other.
Mhm.
But it works very well for the vocal chemistry they have. And for me, like one of my favorite aspects of the album that I included in this production category was just the mixing and the mastering of it and how everything was tied together so well. It really made it like a cohesive body of music rather than just like the sum of these individual parts, like the vocals here and the instrumentals here and the lyrics here. It was all like just one musical art piece that made it really well done. So I gave the production an 8, just because again I think there's been better produced albums this year, and I think
Mhm.
Yachty's been on a better produced album recently. It's pretty close to James Blake's last album for me, but I will say I even think that one has a little bit more interesting stuff on there. But I loved what it did to complement their vocal work.
Yeah.
And speaking of that, in talking about the vocal aspects, how did you feel about such a unique blend on this album?
I I've gotten to the point where I love Yachty's voice, and I'm not gonna lie, while listening through, I still didn't know who James Blake was, not just in knowing who the person is, but knowing when he came on. I just wasn't paying enough attention to like hear when they were like each doing their thing. But the vocals altogether sounded amazing. I ended up giving it an 8. There were definitely um a couple spots in a couple songs where you know it wasn't the greatest vocal performance, but there's definitely way more good than bad, I'd say. I wouldn't even necessarily say that those spots were bad, but more like little hiccups, like could have been worked on, but like it's whatever. Um, but I thought it sounded those are my two highest um qualities of the album are the production and vocals. I think it blended very, very well together.
Yeah, I agree. I think so it like James Blake, it's funny because he does have a very subtle vocal delivery that you almost can like overlook it if you're not like trying to dissect out the moments that
Yeah.
he comes um in the moments where you hear kind of this vocal dip to like a deeper tone,
Hmm.
and like it's almost like a deeper nasally kind of tone, like it's very uh airy
Yeah.
almost. It's like the male opposite tone of Billie Eilish almost. I
Oh.
don't know how to describe it better than that. But anyways, he's like kind of the opposite because Lil Yachty kind of does this higher pitched stuff
Yeah.
a lot, and then he's kind of the lower vocals of it. But that unique blend of their voices I really liked throughout it. And I think there's a lot of give and take on the album, when you do kind of dissect which artists coming in. Like it's not like just a standard, two artist album where it's like you sing the first half, I'll sing the second half. There's a
Yeah.
lot of like weaving back and forth. Though there is some moments where it's just like, okay, James Blake's on the chorus and Lil Yachty will give us a verse, and that's
Yeah.
kind of it. But I will say I think it's Lil Yachty's strongest vocal work to date, in terms of top to bottom how well it's done. Let's Start Here was another one that I really loved his vocal performances on, but there was a lot of moments on there that I was like, certain parts aren't working for me as much. This one I felt like was a lot more top to bottom, really strong from him.
Yeah.
Um, so I gave the vocals a 9 because of that. It was my favorite part of the album, just hearing their vocal chemistry.
Yeah.
Um, And let's go into something that I don't really feel like either of us would say is Lil Yachty's forte here, but talking about the lyrics on the project. Um, I'll be honest, this was not like in my 2, 3 listens through this, it was not something that I was like dissecting.
Yeah.
What about for you? Were you diving into these at all?
No, I decided not to really listen to the lyrics very strongly after the slut bar in the very first track. I was like, I'm just
Yeah.
not gonna pay attention all that much, or else this is gonna probably hurt the album for
Yeah.
me. And yeah, so after that, after the first time, I was like, okay, this is like a good album. And then I heard the slut bar again, and I was like, yeah, I just won't pay attention to the lyrics at all. So I ended up
Yeah.
giving it a 6. I just because I mean there are a couple lines that you'll hear where it's like, I mean, not like thought provoking or nothing like that, but like they're decent lyrics. It's
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Really like what I was feeling is listening to it and having it kind of put you in that headspace of just it's really just enjoying the sound. And that's
Yeah.
what I think their voices and the production do, to the point where I was like, it doesn't really even matter to me what they're saying. Like I'm just here for the sonic aspect, like
Yeah.
what we're hearing from the sound. I did kind of skim through some of the lyrics and kind of follow along in this last listen through it. And like standard, like you're saying, Lil Yachty, you're gonna get some super cheesy stuff. James Blake, not a bad writer, but not like whoever you want to pull out of a hat and Nas or whatever. Um, but uh, there are a couple moments where it's like there's a little bit of depth or like a little bit of thought added to the subject matter, in talking about like fame and dealing with the negatives that come along with it. But it's nothing really that I think hasn't been covered by other artists better. And in going like just in kind of looking over our last few reviews, this isn't a category that I feel like I've gone really easy on, that like doesn't actually reflect how I feel about lyrics and music. So in the spirit of being just a little bit more harsh on these things, I did give it a 6 because it's not great, but I will give credit where credit's due on it. And it's
Yeah.
not really what I'm listening to this for. But I'm not just going to give it a 7 or an 8 just because I'm not, paying attention to those as much on this project.
Yeah.
Anyways, you asked me a question about this next subject just recently. There's no real theme here. We're covering a lot of different subjects on this album, from like we talked about fame and relationships and kind of the relationship to hip hop and just music in general and the industry and all those kinds of things. But let's just talk more about the tone of the album, kind of the relaxing nature of it, and kind of that cohesive flow of the project.
Yeah, so since we're going off tone and feel for the concept this time, I'd give it like a 7. Um just because like I said at the beginning, it's very relaxing, and you don't really have to worry about like what you were saying, the lyrics or nothing like that. I still don't even really know what to say about these things. Like it's cool. Like it's cool, like,
Yeah.
but it's harder when you do listen to each individual song, and like you said, you hear that, oh, this one's talking about fame, and then all these different subjects come into play, because then I feel like it differentiates from the actual vibe, because you're getting all of these very airy vocals and these very relaxing productions, but here and there you're getting these heavier topics or something that's very real. So the lyrics and the concept of each song become very different than the tone and the vibe of said album. So I 7.
Yeah, I agree. I gave it a 7 also, because it does, I think, work in the album's favor to have like this 45-minute project that has a very um, what's the word I'm looking for? Continuous, relaxing nature and tone to it.
Mhm.
Um, in terms of its sound and in the flow of it. But I do think it could have benefited from a little more direction. I felt like a lot of times I was left feeling like this is just kind of a beautiful stretch of soundscape rather than a well put together album from
Yeah.
these two artists. And I know they're both very capable of it, even just pulling from their two recent albums. I think James Blake's last project had a great flow to it, in tackling a lot of, subjects along kind of the tone that it set, um, in kind of religion and life and death and all those kinds of things. And then Let's Start Here, I think, also had a great flow to it that was a little more well rounded and put together to kind of give it a cohesive, crafted narrative and style throughout. There's kind of a little bit of half baked thoughts on the album, like you're
Mhm.
talking about. Like we're kind of getting into like relationship troubles and fame troubles and their relationship with the music industry and how they want to approach their lives and all these kinds of things. But they like we don't ever really get closed stories here. Like we don't ever find out what the end of what they're talking about is. It's just kind of
Yeah.
like, I hate the fame and my girl dumped me. Next song. It's like, okay. Not that that's necessarily a terrible thing, but I did give it a 7 as well, just because I feel like there could have been a better narrative crafted, just a little more put together, and completed. Almost is the word that
Yeah.
I'm looking for. But anyways, nonetheless, still a good soundscape, top to bottom. And let's get into the lack of features on this album. I guess, take what you will with features because there's two artists instead of one.
Right.
Um, but how do you feel about just hearing Lil Yachty and James Blake do their thing pretty solo here?
Yeah, so I ended up giving it a 7. I give a little bit more leeway when it's a two artist album. Um just because that in itself is a feature for whoever. Um and I've heard a couple collab albums from plenty of different artists, and I think the other two that I'm really thinking about are Ty Dolla Sign and Kanye, and then Drake and 21. Um, Out of those three, this is the best that I've heard. Just when it comes to chemistry and the vocal feel, I feel like they complement each other very, very well. And even though like throughout this album, I've said that I don't know when James Blake is coming in, or I don't really know who he is or like what's going on, at least it doesn't sound bad to the point where I'm like, who the heck is this dude and why is he ruining this track on this one? Um,
Yeah.
at the same time, it just because I love collabs, maybe one or two other artists, nothing crazy because it, like you said, it's only a 44-minute album. It's nothing crazy, but
Mm-hmm.
like one or two other features, different artists, um, I think would have livened it up a little bit. Granted, that's probably not the vibe they wanted to have and why they didn't get other people, but for personal reasons, that's just something I think would be cool and intriguing to hear. But nonetheless, it was still great overall, so I gave it a 7.
Yeah, I agree, with a lot of the sentiment that you said. Particularly, I would as well say it's better than the Drake 21 and the Kanye and Ty Dolla projects. But I think between Lil Yachty and James Blake, there isn't really too much need for more presence on the album. Like you're saying, I think a well matched feature here or there could have added something to the album, added an element to it. But like, I really don't need to hear a Drake feature or a Travis
Right.
feature or a J. Cole just because they know each other really well. If something were to fit and they added it, great. I think it could have added an element, but it's not necessarily something that like I was listening to this album thinking like I'm so sick of hearing this same guy's voice
Yeah.
like with the Imagine Dragons project, where we're 11 tracks in and Dan Reynolds is still the only one talking, and it's like, okay, we need a little switch up here. It wasn't like that at all on this project.
Right.
So I gave it an 8 just because I didn't think it needed it, but I think it could have added something had they found something that worked really well. And to kind of wrap all this up, let's talk about the replay value, the overall enjoyment. Like you started off saying, I don't know that this is necessarily your avenue per se, but how do you feel about how do you think this project can age for you?
Yeah, it's still hard for me to get into this kind of music, but I definitely have so much more appreciation for this style of music. Um, it's for me, experimental albums are like your movie soundtracks that you'll just kind of like listen to and vibe with. That's how they are for me. Like if it's on, cool, I am so down for it, but I'm not going out of my way. So at least that's kind of different than what you do. But I won't go out of my way unless I really like a song. This one I didn't there wasn't really much for me to want to come back to. There was probably like one or two songs that I thought were like exceptional, really, really good songs. I gave it a 6, and it only got knocked to a 6 just because of the replay value, not necessarily the enjoyment of the album, because I enjoyed it all the way through. Um, but it's the replay value where it kind of got docked a couple points.
Yeah, for sure. Respectable take there. For me, this is a project that I think I'll come back to pretty frequently. Um, and already I've like listening through it. There's some albums where even if you like it, it's kind of like to do a review like this and revisiting it multiple times in a short span. You're kind of like, okay, like it's not like it's still a good project, but like I want to kind of get something fresh added to it. It never
Yeah.
felt like a chore for me listening through this album to kind of do this review. And then even outside of like prepping for this review, when it's just come on in my rotation, I'm stoked to hear it. Um, I think a great sound system or headphones are kind of a must when you're listening to this project,
Yeah.
because there's been times when it's on in my car and it like I like doesn't have the best sound system, and I'm like not getting the same enjoyment that I do when I've got a good pair of headphones or when
Yeah.
I'm in, have a good speaker or whatever. But I think there's a lot of unique and innovative material that breaks up the monotony of kind of everything else going on in the mainstream standard genres that I normally listen to or that I feel like get a lot of mainstream attention. And so I love having something like that in my rotation where it's fresh, it's new, it's different sounding, but it sounds really good. It's not just like noise or like
Mhm.
experimental for the sake of being experimental, where it's actually something that sounds really good. So for me, the replay value gets an 8. I don't like it. I wouldn't say it's going to age like a top 10 album ever for me or anything like
Yeah.
that. I wouldn't even say it's like a very top of my list project of this year, but it's really good and I do really like it. And so I think there's only a couple songs that I don't have in my music mix right now. Not that all of it gets a listen every day, but you
Right.
know what I mean. And so overall, the album for me came out to just above a 7.5 out of 10, which is pretty good. Like I would say 7.5, maybe up to an 8, depending on how it kind of ages over the next little bit. But what about for you?
Yeah. So mine came right to a 7, and I'm cool with that. That seems exactly how I would rate it. So
Fair enough. And do you have like best worst songs on the album?
yep. So for the best and the most underrated, I found, at least for me, I think they come at the end of the album. I think the best song is Runaway from the Rabbit. Um, I This is one of those songs where I thoroughly enjoyed it. I loved the sound. I think the vocals were this is one of the songs where it was the very best, the peak of the album. Um, So I personally loved that one. The worst one I think is Missing Man. I just didn't like the
Hmm.
sound of it. Yeah, I just couldn't get into that one whatsoever. He kept saying Missing Man, and I was like, no.
Is
Um,
that's the one where they shout like reset at the end of every
I
chorus, right?
think so. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's just I don't know. It just
Hmm.
felt like the oddball out.
Yeah, for sure.
So
I will say for me, I like almost enjoyed that obscurity just in that it was like so unique sounding that
yeah,
I like it was catchy almost in that way to me. But a very respectable
yeah.
pick
It
there.
see, and I even get where you're coming from. Just for me, it's like when I'm listening through an album and I'm already getting this consistent vibe throughout a majority of this, and then on what I think this is like the eighth track or something like that, and it
Yeah.
just kind of out of left field hits you with yeah. So
Yeah.
I wasn't for it. Um, but then I think the most underrated is Red Carpet. I think it's a great end to the album. Um, when we first kind of started talking about, oh, like, are we gonna do Lil Yachty? You were saying that basically every song was trending at a certain point.
Yeah.
Um, I feel like um with a lot of albums, the last song usually doesn't get all that much love. Which I mean makes sense for just about any project, but that's why it's my underrated.
Yeah, for sure. For me, the best song, and really this changed even just in my last listen to it, but I really liked the track Woo. I think it
Mhm.
was really well made. The beat was really engaging vocally. I think they both sounded great. It was just like the peak of kind of everything that I loved about the album on that one. The worst one I put Twice, and
Mm.
I don't think it's necessarily a trash song. It was just the 3 minute Lil Yachty outro where he's just like talking to this girl, and it was like it not nearly in the same realm, but it was almost like on the Drake project with for all the dogs where he has that girl just like complaining for the last like 3 minutes of the track, and Lil Yachty's like just like, why are you telling everybody about our business? And I was like, dude, we've been talking about this for 3 minutes. Like,
Is
let's
that
like
one?
we don't need this anymore.
Is that the one
Um,
where he's like F him?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
So I was just like, it was just too long. If it was like a 20
yeah.
second outro, it'd be fine. But anyways, my most underrated track that I put was Transport Me. Um, and the reason that this one was underrated to me, and like I almost underrated it in the first place, was I think this is the seventh or eighth track on the album. And
Mm.
at this point, like we're kind of established in what the album's doing. And then Lil Yachty comes in after like 30 seconds with, I'm not gonna say he's like Eminem or J. Cole or Kendrick Lamar energy, but he's like coming in and like actually rapping and doing
Yeah.
something kind of cool with like some urgency. And I was like, holy crap, why is Lil Yachty like flowing over this beat so well? I didn't feel like this was a rap album, but here he is. I thought that was kind of a cool moment to add to it. I think the track overall kind of turned out pretty good because of that. But yeah, another one that I enjoyed a fair
Yeah.
amount.
Good songs, good choices.
Yeah. Any thoughts from you to wrap up this project here?
Definitely give it a listen if you haven't. If this does make my top 10, it won't break the top five, but I could see it as a low top 10. Yeah, it's a cool listen through, especially if you're one who um like studies or just if you're somebody who like drives to get a break and just clear your mind. This is great background music in my opinion. Solid track.
Yeah, I for me, I would say it's probably also not a top five of the year, but it might. It's hard to say because we're early in the year, but
Yeah.
for sure, it's up there as one of my more favorite projects right now. Again, like you said, just a great vibe to listen to if you haven't heard it, or if you want something that's just kind of an interesting cool, relaxing soundscape. But yeah, Lil Yachty, James Blake, well put together. I think I was watching a video of, I think it was Anthony Fantano reviewing the album,
Mhm.
and he was like, a lot of people might say this is kind of a weird collab from these two artists, but it's more peanut butter and jelly than it is oil and water. And I was like, wow,
That's a bar.
that's a great way to put it.
That's
Like,
a bar.
yeah. So I Fantano, I will agree with that one there.
Yeah.
Don't know if I agree with everything in his music taste, but that's neither here nor there. Great album, worth a
Yeah.
listen. And I'm betting next week we'll be back probably with some Eminem.
I'm
So
stoked. Also,
yeah,
before we wrap up, just because on the last episode you gave a little preview of Lupe, I
yeah,
did get a chance to give to listen through, and I agree with basically everything you said. It's cool. It's not 100% like my kind of music. Definitely worth a listen. I think it's
yeah,
cool, but at times I feel like he's trying to be like super thought provoking and like let me use all of the most wild words I can find in the
yeah,
dictionary and put them together. So, it's cool. Probably like I think you said you would give it like a 7
yeah.
or
7, 8,
yeah.
somewhere around there.
Yeah.
It's pretty similar in like how I
Yeah.
felt about this one,
Yeah,
but for a little
100%
different
agree.
reasons.
But yeah, so if you haven't given that a listen, it's a cool listen. It's a cool
Yeah,
listen.
for sure, for
So,
sure.
there's that.
And with that, we'll wrap up for today. I appreciate everybody listening in.
Cheers.
Bon voyage.
What do they say? I bid adieu. Is that
Yeah, sure.
yeah. All right, bye.
Bye.